The sky above trial zone. Cora 7 looked like molten steel, streaked with veins of green lightning, and the ground trembled with irregular pulses, as though the planet itself was breathing through broken lungs. This was the site of the final course at the Galactic Academy, an unforgiving simulation of a true Deathworld environment meant to break cadets physically, mentally, and emotionally. It had a reputation that spoke louder than the instructors. More than 90% of cadets failed within the first 36 hours. Of those who survived longer, only a handful lasted through the full 7-day trial. The drop pods cut through the toxic upper layers of the atmosphere like burning meteors. Mira Caldwell's pod was the last to hit the surface. It struck the jagged ground with a jolt, skidding across a slope and partially burying itself under brittle layers of black shale. Inside, Mira sat calmly, her breathing even, her body pressed into the restraints. She didn't rush to unbuckle herself. She waited until the violent shuddering of the pod faded, until the outer sensors blinked into dormancy, indicating the worst of the turbulence had passed. Then, with methodical ease, she disengaged the harness and reached for the side compartment. Around her, the others had already scattered. The first 10 minutes were a scramble of movement. From her window, she saw heat signatures running downhill, others bolting into craggy caves, and some already firing up drone systems that would inevitably short-circuit under the planet's hostile magnetic fields. Mira didn't move. She opened her kit, removed a folded thermal blanket, a tin of herbal concentrate, a flint striker, and a collapsible kettle. Then she kicked the pod door open, stepped outside, and let the environment speak to her. The air was dense with static. It clung to her hair, lifting strands from her scalp as if she were underwater. The wind moved strangely, fast at ground level but oddly still higher up, like a reversed waterfall. The temperature shifted with no rhythm, oscillating between numbing cold and skin-scorching heat in uneven intervals. In the distance, Mira saw a Lurvek cadet leap from one rock to another and misjudge the shift in gravity. His body twisted awkwardly in midair before slamming into a jagged pillar. He didn't rise. Another cadet screamed, something about faulty boots, and vanished into a crevice that hadn't been there a moment ago. Mira blinked once, exhaled, and walked to a ridge with partial cover. She didn't fight the environment. She acknowledged it. Atop the ridge, she spread her blanket across the flattest surface she could find, anchoring the corners with palm-sized rocks. Then she built a tiny triangular frame using metallic slats from her broken pod wing and suspended the kettle over a low flame she sparked with careful strokes. It took 3 tries. The wind was unpredictable, but soon the water began to warm, absorbing heat slowly. Mira sprinkled a pinch of dried herbs into the kettle, inhaling the subtle scent of mint and bitter root. The smell reminded her of Earth, of cool nights on her grandmother's porch, and of stories told without words. She sat cross-legged, eyes scanning the horizon as steam began to rise. All around her, the chaos escalated. Alien cadets of varying physiology and survival strategies ran from threat to threat. A group of Scalevians attempted to dig shelter using plasma cutters, but triggered a ground resonance that caused the soil to liquefy. Their entire structure sank within seconds. A pair of Tyrellian twins, known for their aggressive survival instinct, tried to charge uphill to claim higher ground, but the gravity reversed midway, slamming them back to the base with bone-snapping force. Instructors watched from orbit, silently noting every dropout. Mira sipped her tea. She didn't panic. She didn't run. Her pulse remained steady because she understood what most of the others didn't. This trial wasn't about endurance. It wasn't about strength or speed. It was about rhythm, about learning the planet's strange breath and syncing with it. Every Deathworld had a pulse, and if one listened long enough, the patterns emerged. The wind hissed before turning toxic. The ground bulged slightly before collapsing. The temperature dropped just seconds before a static storm. Mira didn't resist these signs. She mapped them. From her vantage point, she could see 4 cadets huddled inside a semi-melted energy dome that flickered with failing power. Their faces were pale, their limbs shaking from stress and heat. One of them made eye contact with her. It was a Zorvian, muscular, covered in pale orange scales and breathing heavily through fractured gill lines on his neck. He stared at Mira, confused. She didn't wave. She simply lifted her cup, took another sip, and turned back to the horizon. The sun, if it could be called that, was pulsing rather than shining, a bulbous mass that spat irregular light waves in sweeping arcs. Shadows didn't follow the rules of direction here. They bent around her, sometimes forming a second silhouette behind her, as though the planet was mimicking her actions in mockery or curiosity. She let the illusion play, neither afraid nor impressed. This was a test, not an apocalypse, and she had already decided to pass it on her terms. The worst mistake others made, she knew, was to let the environment dictate their decisions. Panic made poor navigators. Fear clouded perception. She hadn't joined the Galactic Academy because she wanted medals or status. She had joined because she wanted to understand life at its limits. And this planet, violent, strange, and alive in a way few understood, was exactly the kind of challenge she had hoped for. By evening, 23 cadets had already activated their distress beacons, forfeiting the test. 10 more were missing from the satellite count. The instructors debated whether to intervene in one quadrant where a mud geyser had swallowed an entire hill. Still, Mira remained on her ridge, making another cup of tea, her movements slow and deliberate. She marked the rock beside her with a small piece of chalk she had brought. 1 line for every hour survived. 1 dot for every pattern discovered. Beneath her markings were small symbols, wind shifts, animal calls, gravity echoes, her way of learning the planet's language. She wasn't just surviving, she was listening. Night came suddenly. The air chilled to near freezing in under a minute. Mira wrapped herself in the blanket and curled near the warm stones she had used to heat her kettle. She didn't sleep fully, just closed her eyes between pulses of wind, letting her body rest while her mind tracked the subtle sounds around her. Nocturnal predators emerged in the distance, their outlines tall and insectoid, their joints moving with awkward elasticity. They sniffed at the wind, paused, and moved on. Mira's scent was masked by the ash of her fire. She had burned root bark earlier, a trick learned during Earth's deep jungle survival simulations. It worked. Above her, the stars were sharp, closer, it seemed, than on any other world. One flickered in a specific rhythm, not natural. A comm probe. The instructors were watching closely now. Mira didn't look up. She didn't need validation. She knew how this would unfold. Tomorrow, more cadets would drop. Some from injury, some from panic, some from refusing to sit still long enough to realize that stillness was the key. Mira would stay. Mira would observe. Mira would boil another kettle of tea. And when others came crawling toward her, desperate and disoriented, she would make room on the blanket. The second dawn on Cora, 7 rose not with light, but with a tremor that rolled across the plains like the pulse of a hidden heart. The ground quivered under Mira's palms as she stirred the last of the embers from her small fire into a faint glow. She had slept in fragments through the night, half alert and half dreaming, listening to the irregular sounds of the world. Now her senses told her the environment had shifted. The air had thickened. The static had deepened from a faint tingle to a low, resonant hum. The gravity had stabilized for the moment but pressed down slightly harder than before, as if the planet wanted to pin her to its surface. Mira sat upright, folded her blanket into a tight square, and tucked it beneath her pack. She poured the remainder of her tea into a small cup and drank it slowly, letting its warmth root her before the next cycle began. She moved with a steady rhythm. She knew the mistakes the others were making. Somewhere in the dark, she had heard the heavy footfalls of cadets running through the toxic mist, the sounds of plasma bursts, the hollow crashes of collapsing shelters. None of it had reached her ridge. Her ridge was a listening post, a heartbeat above the chaos, and she guarded it with patience. She rose now, stretching her arms upward, testing the current of the wind. It brushed against her fingertips like charged silk, prickling the skin. She marked the direction in her mind and noted the slight sourness in the air. Acid mist would roll through soon. She would need to relocate for a few hours, but she felt no urgency. Cora 7's dangers were not random. They were timed, and she had begun to read the intervals. She slid down the slope with her knees bent, her body low to the ground. Her boots crunched over brittle layers of mineral crust. Below, a thin stand of vine-like growths had begun to curl upward, pale and translucent. Mira crouched to inspect them. Her fingers traced the surface of one stalk. It was slick with moisture and faintly glowing. She plucked a small section, rubbed it between her fingers, and smelled it. The scent was sharp, like crushed copper. Poisonous in quantity, she suspected, but useful in minute doses. She stored a strip in a separate pouch for testing later. Every plant was a clue, every texture a message. The planet was teaching her, and she was determined to learn. A distant sound made her lift her head. It was not the hiss of gas vents or the groan of shifting rock. It was a voice, high and hoarse, calling for help. She moved toward it, careful and deliberate, stepping only where the crust seemed firm. She found the source beyond a jagged outcrop. A cadet crouched in a shallow depression, her skin mottled with frost from the sudden cold surge that had struck at dawn. She was crystalline in form, her limbs refracting the dim light into rainbows. But now her glow was dim. Her breathing was shallow, her fingers trembling as she clutched a broken oxygen line. Mira approached without a word. She knelt beside the cadet, wrapped her in the folded blanket to trap whatever heat remained, and opened her own pack. She poured a measure of warm tea into a second cup and held it near the cadet's mouth. "Sip slowly," she said softly. The cadet obeyed, her voice a faint rasp of gratitude. Mira didn't smile. She adjusted the blanket, scanning the horizon for changes. The mist would come soon. When the cadet's shivering eased, Mira rose and motioned for her to follow. Together they moved toward a cluster of stone hollows she had scouted the previous day but had not used. The hollows were shallow and irregular, but offered just enough overhang to shield against wind bursts. Mira placed the cadet in the largest one, broke a few shards of dried root bark, and sparked a low fire using her striker. She brewed another kettle of tea, adding a sliver of the vine she had collected for a faint stimulant effect. The cadet watched her, silent, eyes flicking between Mira's steady hands and the flickering flames. Around them, the world hissed with invisible tension. The first fingers of mist rolled in from the valley like pale snakes slithering over the ground. It hissed when it touched rock, leaving faint etch marks. Mira shifted closer to the wall of the hollow, adjusting her scarf over her nose. She had prepared a simple filter mask from fabric and moss, secured with metal clips from her kit. She handed a second one to the cadet, gesturing for her to wear it. The cadet hesitated, then obeyed. The mist thickened until the outside world became a blurred sea of white. Screams echoed faintly through it, quickly cut off. Mira closed her eyes and listened for the rhythm beneath the chaos, the hiss, the pause, the drip of condensed acid, the rumble of subsurface movement. Patterns. Always patterns. Hours passed like that. Mira did not speak except to give small instructions. She shared tea when the cadet's breathing grew rough, adjusted the fire when the temperature dipped too low, and scratched new symbols into the stone floor of the hollow to mark each shift in the environment. She was not saving one cadet for sentiment. She was building a system. One life anchored another. A pattern anchored a mind. She had learned that on Earth's oceans, where storms tested patience more than muscle. Now, she practiced it here. When the mist finally thinned, revealing a scorched landscape of blackened rock and new fissures, Mira stepped out first. The cadet followed, steadier now, wrapped in the blanket like a fragile relic. Above them, the sun pulsed again, and the gravity lightened. Mira inhaled deeply, tasting the metallic tang in the air. She marked the change, then led the cadet back up the ridge. Her camp was as she had left it, blanket folded, kettle tucked away, embers faint but alive. She reignited the fire with a single strike and set water to boil. The cadet sank to her knees, exhausted but alive, eyes fixed on the steam rising from the kettle. More figures appeared on the horizon as the day wore on. Cadets stumbling, limping, dragging broken equipment. Word had spread in fragments through private comms about a human with tea on the ridge. Mira saw them, one by one, and said nothing. She poured tea for the crystalline cadet, sipped from her own cup, and stared at the horizon. The planet had shown her its rhythm. She had survived another cycle. Now she would teach others, but not with speeches or commands. She would teach them with stillness, one cup at a time. The wind shifted again before sunrise. Mira felt it in her fingertips as she rubbed a piece of bark between her hands to start her morning fire. The texture of the air had changed. It was dry now, sharp with static and emptier than before, as though the planet had paused its breath. She knew from the symbols she had etched in the stone that a new cycle had begun. The mist had receded fully, but that didn't mean safety. On Cora 7, calm was a prelude to violence. The crystalline cadet, Nira, as she had quietly offered the night before, sat wrapped in Mira's blanket, still weak but more alert. Her fractured outer limbs had begun to reform faintly, their prisms less cloudy than before. Mira handed her a warm cup of diluted vine tea. Nira accepted it with both hands, her eyes now tracking movement instead of staring at the ground. Mira didn't speak much. Words were a precious resource out here, like warmth, used only when necessary. A sound broke through the brittle quiet, staggered footfalls. Mira turned her head slowly and spotted another cadet emerging over the ridge. His gait was uneven, his left shoulder slumped unnaturally. He was a Xerathon, tall, broad-shouldered, with bark-like skin that split into vertical plates when under strain. His face was dusted with ash, and his breathing was loud even before he reached the camp. Mira said nothing. She simply gestured to the kettle and placed another cup on the ground beside the fire. He looked at her, confused, then dropped heavily to his knees and accepted the drink. He didn't ask questions. He understood the silence. The temperature rose steadily over the next 2 hours. The fire was no longer necessary, and Mira let it die out on its own. She watched as another figure crested the edge of the slope, a lean, multi-limbed Mixari whose glossy skin had dulled from dehydration. The cadet collapsed halfway to the group. Mira stood, walked down to her, and pulled her arm over her shoulder. The Mixari's limbs trembled as Mira helped her to the circle of stones, sat her down, and placed a hand over her back until her breathing slowed. The ridge, once isolated and silent, had become a quiet island. One by one, broken cadets arrived, not because they had coordinated their movements, but because instinct had drawn them toward something stable. Mira didn't look at them with superiority. She didn't issue orders or teach lectures. She folded her blanket so it covered more ground, divided her herbs into smaller portions, and gestured toward the water whenever a new cadet sat near the edge. Some said thank you. Most said nothing. But all of them stayed. By midday, there were 6 cadets gathered in a semicircle, each sitting in silence, wrapped in strips of thermal cloth or their own tattered coats. The rhythm Mira had cultivated extended outward like invisible roots, settling into the broken minds around her. The first few resisted it. One cadet, a silver-furred Darvathi, paced in frustrated circles, muttering about missed checkpoints and rescue times. She kept glancing at the sky, demanding answers from a sun that didn't answer. Mira didn't stop her. She let her burn out her panic. Eventually, the Darvathi dropped to her knees, sweating despite the thin air, and accepted a cup of warm liquid without a word. Her pacing ended. Her breathing slowed. In the afternoon, Mira began drawing again. She used a shard of sharp crystal and scraped symbols into a smooth patch of rock beside her. Some were simple, Slashes for temperature shifts, dots for wind reversals, spirals for predator sightings. Others were more abstract, markers of rhythm, of environmental patterns she had learned to feel in her bones. The crystalline cadet watched curiously, then copied her onto another stone using her own claws. The Zerothan observed and eventually scratched his own lines beside hers. Without a word, a shared language began to emerge. The cadets didn't speak, but they listened. Mira noticed it in the way they sipped their drinks more slowly now, matching her pace. They adjusted their positions when she did, folding their legs or hunching into a more energy-efficient posture. Some mimicked her stretches before sleep. It wasn't submission. It was resonance. The chaos inside them had found something predictable, something real. Just before dusk, the wind returned. Not the misty wind from the day before, but something heavier, more urgent. It pushed low against the surface, carving shallow lines in the ash. Mira stood and scanned the horizon. She felt it before she saw it. Pulse waves beneath the crust, timed like a heartbeat. Something was coming. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the soil. After 6 long seconds, the pulse repeated. She narrowed her eyes. That rhythm was familiar, not natural. It was a predator. She looked around the group. Most were too weak to run. Even if they had been healthy, there was nowhere to go. The slopes were unstable, and the caves would collapse under pressure. Mira stood and moved quickly, gathering stones, bones, and scraps of equipment. She began stacking them in a semicircle, just wide enough to shield the group from one side. The Zerothan watched and rose to help her without needing instruction. He lifted the heavier slabs, reinforcing the side facing the wind. Mira nodded once. He nodded back. The predator revealed itself an hour later. It didn't roar. It didn't charge. It simply appeared at the edge of the ridge, its body rising like a shadow against the pulsing sky. Long and sleek, with 6 limbs and skin like melted glass, it shimmered with residual electricity. It moved low to the ground, sniffing the air, cautious but hungry. Mira crouched near the fire pit, her body still, her breath shallow. The others did the same, not because she told them to, but because they understood the stakes. She had studied predators like this before. It hunted through tremor sensing. Stillness was the only shield. The group froze. No one moved. Not even the Mixari cadet, who trembled beneath her outer layer but held her pose. The predator crept forward. It passed within 10 meters of the circle. Mira's pulse thundered in her ears, but her expression remained calm. The beast paused, tilted its head, then let out a sharp click, an echolocating pulse that echoed against the rock wall. The stone shield held. The creature snorted, turned, and vanished into the shadows as quickly as it had arrived. No one exhaled for a full minute. Then, slowly, Mira stood and rekindled the fire. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The others understood. She poured more water, prepared more tea, and added a pinch of root for strength. She passed the cups around. The circle drank in silence, their eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something else. Understanding. Trust. Later that night, the wind eased, and Mira sat with her back against the rock wall, her head tilted toward the sky. The stars flickered faintly above, their patterns shifting slowly. One of the cadets, Nira, leaned over and whispered something Mira hadn't expected to hear. "Why are you doing this?" Mira didn't answer at first. She stared at the flames, then at the faces lit by their glow. "Because it's not about passing," she finally said. "It's about not breaking." Nira nodded once and said nothing more. The group fell into rest again, scattered among stones, curled against heat. Mira stayed awake the longest, her eyes half closed but alert. The world would shift again soon. She needed to be ready. But she also knew she wouldn't be alone anymore. Tomorrow, more would come. The 4th day began without light. A curtain of red ash drifted slowly through the air, muting the sun's pulse and casting a bruised hue over the landscape. Mira stirred beneath her thermal wrap and opened her eyes to the sound of soft breathing. Around her, the cadets slept, some curled tightly in blankets, others slouched upright in the postures of cautious rest. The ridge had transformed. No longer a solitary perch above chaos, it had become a sanctuary. But Mira knew sanctuaries didn't last long on Cora 7. The planet always shifted the rules. She sat up, brushing soot from her shoulder, and listened. The wind had a new edge, drier, more fragmented, whispering in sharp bursts like fractured speech. The air stung slightly with each inhale, a warning sign. Volcanic pressure was building somewhere beneath the surface. She felt it in her knees and the base of her skull. Mira rose quietly and stepped beyond the ring of stones. The slope below had changed overnight. Jagged ridges once smooth were now split and steaming. She crouched and pressed her palm to the crust. Warm. Too warm. She stood and looked toward the others. Most of the cadets were awake now, eyes adjusting slowly to the unnatural red glow. Nira blinked slowly and sat up with a low sigh. The Zerothan cadet stretched and cracked his shoulders before reaching for a half-finished stick of dried rations. The Mixari girl whispered something to herself and tapped her fingers against her own forearm, a habit Mira had come to recognize as self-check calibration. Mira walked to the fire pit, knelt beside it, and rekindled it with a few measured strikes. The flame came reluctantly, but steady. She added water to the kettle, then her tea mixture, a carefully rationed blend of calming roots, hydration herbs, and a pinch of stimulant. This blend had become a lifeline. By the time steam coiled into the air, 3 more figures had appeared along the path. They moved slowly, hunched under the weight of exhaustion. Mira didn't speak. She simply nodded once and placed 3 more cups in the circle. The new arrivals collapsed near the heat, murmured thanks, and drank in silence. One was a Galkari, her insectoid limbs trembling from cold fatigue. Another was a thin Avixen male whose wings had been scorched to uselessness. The third, a bruised Okwari, sat with his back to the wall, eyes closed as he cradled his left arm, a dislocated joint that throbbed under torn muscle. The quiet grew dense as more cadets arrived throughout the morning. Some came alone, others in twos. No one asked questions anymore. The rhythm Mira had established had spread further than she'd anticipated. Whispers in the comms, fragments of signal, half-seen beacons. The news had moved like vapor. The human was alive, and she had fire, water, and warmth. Mira knew this wasn't about fame or leadership. It was about gravity. She had become a fixed point in a world designed to destabilize. She watched each arrival with careful attention, noting injuries, tracking dehydration signs, observing behavior. She rationed her tea precisely. Each cup was poured with care, each handoff accompanied by a glance. She didn't command, but her presence created direction. When someone stood to help reinforce the stone wall against new wind gusts, others followed. When one cadet mimicked her seated meditation to calm trembling hands, others adjusted their posture. Without structure, the ridge had begun to follow form. That afternoon, the first conversation emerged. A young cadet, lean, copper-skinned, with silicate tattoos glowing faintly on his neck, cleared his throat and spoke softly to Mira as she poured him another cup. "Why tea?" he asked. "Out of everything you could have chosen to focus on here, why this?" Mira didn't look up. She stirred the leaves once, then answered, "Because it's simple, and it slows the panic." The boy nodded, though he clearly wanted to ask more. Mira handed him the cup and motioned for him to sit. She returned to the fire, where Nira and the Zerothon were assembling a basic wind barrier from salvaged metal rods and fused glass shards. The design was simple, but the alignment was precise. Mira crouched to adjust the angle of a reflective piece, nodded once in approval, and stepped back. Soon, cadets began offering fragments of their own supplies. Someone contributed a filtration mesh. Another provided a compact heat stone. One cadet produced a tiny compass-like tool, broken but repairable. Mira accepted each gift with a nod, integrated them into the system, and never hoarded anything. Everything was visible. Everything was shared. The rule was unspoken but solid. No one asked for more than a cup and a seat. No one took more than was given, and no one disrupted the rhythm. As dusk approached, the rumbling under the ridge deepened. Mira stood at the edge and scanned the valley below. Red plumes had begun to rise from a fault line that now split the terrain like an open wound. The scent of sulfur grew heavier. The planet was going to purge soon, either through gas vents or tremor sweeps. She calculated time by the sun's pulse. 2 hours, maybe 3. She turned and signaled to the others with a short whistle and a raised hand. The cadets grew still. Mira pointed to the valley and traced a slow line toward the eastern rock wall. Then she pointed to the ridge and made a pressing gesture with her palm. Stay low. Stay centered. They understood. Without a word, cadets tightened their wraps, checked bindings, secured loose gear. The wind picked up, sweeping the ash into tighter spirals. Mira wrapped her scarf across her nose, added a second layer over her chest, and took the kettle off the fire. She placed it inside a stone alcove and secured it with a net of thermal line. One cadet handed her a heat shield, cracked, but still usable, and she planted it in front of the main fire ring. Another cadet pressed a soft cloth into her palm, and Mira used it to wrap the last of the tea leaves for preservation. When the purge came, it began with silence. All sound dropped, as if the air had been sucked away. Mira crouched, her body pressed into the wall. All around her, cadets did the same. Then the first tremor hit, a deep, grinding shudder that vibrated through bone and rock. Ash exploded into the air. Plumes of superheated gas burst from cracks and rolled across the lower valley like liquid fire. From the ridge, they could see everything. Waves of red and orange tearing through the land. But the wind barrier held. The fire pit held. And most importantly, the group held. When the purge passed, night fell sharply. The stars were visible again, clear and sharp against the black sky. Mira stood slowly, brushing ash from her knees. The others followed. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They had survived. Again. She returned to the fire, pulled the kettle from its hiding spot, and set it gently on the embers. The Mixari girl handed her a piece of dried fruit. Mira accepted it and chewed slowly as the water began to warm. Soon the steam rose again, curling softly like breath in the cold. The tea circle reformed. One by one, cadets returned to their stones, to the silent agreement they had made when they first arrived. To follow rhythm, not panic. To stay. To breathe. To wait. Mira poured the first cup and passed it to the furthest cadet. The circle drank, and Cora, 7, watched. By the 5th dawn, Mira could no longer distinguish between the hours by light. The sky over Cora 7 had shifted into a strange and permanent twilight, thick with amber dust and low magnetic currents that danced just above the rock. The wind had fallen almost entirely silent, but the quiet did not bring peace. It brought tension. Pressure gathered in the planet's bones. Mira could feel it building beneath her feet like an ancient drumbeat growing louder by the hour. The ridge now held 17 cadets. Some sat with quiet discipline, having adopted Mira's way without question. Others still twitched from nerves, speaking only in half-sentences or gestures. But none had left. None had activated their beacons. The circle had solidified, and Mira's presence was now its anchor. She sat near the center of the fire ring with her legs crossed and her eyes half-lidded, listening to the strange sounds emanating from deep within the earth. Her left hand rested over a flat piece of slate where she had continued her markings, diagrams, symbols, and crude cartographic notes built from memory. The lines weren't just data. They were memory. They were rhythm. Across from her, Nira carefully crushed dried leaves using 2 thin stones. Her movements had grown steady, nearly ceremonial. The tea-making was no longer Mira's alone. It had become something shared. A ritual, yes, but also a structure. Each step, boiling, steeping, serving, was predictable. And on a world like Cora 7, predictability was sacred. A sudden shift rippled through the crust, sharp, violent, and unexpected. Mira shot up. A tremor, far stronger than the last, cracked open a segment of the slope below. Dust and debris rose in waves. Two cadets scrambled back as the edge of the ridge broke away beneath them. One lost her footing and would have fallen if the Zerathon hadn't lunged forward and grabbed her wrist. His fingers dug deep into her coat, anchoring her. Mira moved without thinking. She dropped to the ground and pulled both of them back using a line she had kept coiled around her waist. When they were safe, she inspected the edges and confirmed the break wouldn't reach the central area. The group reorganized swiftly. No shouting, no panic. The response was instinctive now. Some reinforced the edges with stones. Others secured gear. Mira returned to the center and began to rebuild the fire. Her heartbeat slowed again. This was the test's final escalation. She could feel it. A crackling sound interrupted the haze of ash above. A comm drone descended slowly from orbit, its lights flickering green as it hovered above the ridge. Mira stood and stepped toward it. The drone projected a soft glow in front of her, and a synthesized voice began to speak. "Final survival report," the voice intoned. "Remaining cadets, 17. Time, 6 full rotations complete. Site integrity, compromised. Extraction window, imminent." The drone paused, scanning the cadets silently seated around the fire. Psychological stabilization observed. Inter-cadet cooperation, non-hierarchical. Central figure identified, human cadet Mira Caldwell. Recorded behavioral anomaly, tea ceremony. Outcome, full cohesion, 0 internal conflict, 0 beacon activation. Galactic Academy deems course completed. Extraction incoming. The drone lifted higher and shot a data beam skyward. Mira turned her back to it. She looked at the others. Nira met her gaze and gave a small nod. The Zerathon dropped into a crouch and stared at the fire, saying nothing. The Mixari girl tapped once on the rock beside her and exhaled. No one celebrated. No one cheered. They all understood something unspoken. The challenge had ended, but something larger had taken root. Within the hour, the sky began to split. The transport ships did not arrive with fanfare. They descended in pairs, silent and angular, kicking up ash as their hatches opened. Medical drones hovered beside them. Academy observers stood stiffly behind translucent helmets, watching from a safe distance. Mira didn't move until the last cadet was ready. One by one, the survivors gathered what little they had. Some carried nothing but scorched packs and dust-stained suits. Others held tightly to the cups Mira had given them, each engraved with faint symbols scratched during the long nights. Mira walked to the ridge's edge one final time. She looked out across the valley, now pockmarked by vents, fissures, and soot-covered ridgelines. There was no beauty in it, not in the traditional sense, but there was structure. There was a story written into its scars. She had read it, and she had endured. She turned, picked up her blanket, and folded it neatly. She tied it to the top of her pack and slung it over her shoulder. Then she approached the transport, stepped inside, and sat quietly near the rear, her posture straight and composed. The Zerathon entered next and sat across from her. He didn't speak, but he placed something on the seat between them. A small stone with her original fire symbol scratched into it. Mira looked at it, then at him, and nodded once. He left it there. As the door closed, the interior of the ship hummed gently. The others filed in, silent but calm, and took their places. No one argued. No one demanded rank or attention. The unity Mira had cultivated in the shadow of storms and fire remained, even under the clean white lights of the transport. Above, the sky faded into the pale blue of the upper atmosphere. Cora 7 shrank below them, hostile, alive, indifferent. Hours later, on the observation deck of the orbiting station, Mira stood before a panel of instructors. Her clothes were cleaned, her body was hydrated, and her wounds were dressed, but her eyes remained the same, steady, unreadable, focused inward. One instructor, an elder being from the Kurel species, finally broke the silence. "You violated standard protocol," he said. "You initiated no forward progress, did not attempt to signal, and made no measurable distance toward escape." Mira didn't answer. Another instructor leaned forward. She was human, tall, with a narrow face and sharp eyes. "And yet," she said, "your group had the highest retention rate in the history of the course. No internal conflict, no injuries requiring evacuation, no mental breaks, not even a panic incident." The first instructor looked back down at his screen. "What do you call this strategy?" Mira shrugged slightly. "Presence." Silence. The human instructor tilted her head. "Why tea?" "Because everyone drinks it differently," Mira said, "and everyone drinks it the same." Neither instructor responded. Mira turned and walked out without waiting for dismissal. In the hallway, cadets passed her without speaking, but one paused, the young boy with the copper skin and glowing neck tattoos. He looked at her, then raised an imaginary cup with both hands, mimicking the way she had taught him. Mira smiled for the first time in days. She raised her hand in return, palm outward, and walked down the corridor. The trial had ended, but the calm she had built would linger far longer than the storm.